Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining in today for the discussion of my forthcoming book, Joseph Brodsky, the English language poet, found in translation, or FIT for short. Dedicated to the work of the Russian poet who won the Nobel Prize in 1987 in Stockholm. It's not a book launch, but my celebrating finishing a contracted book manuscript, which is a little bit unusual, I grant you. And one of the reasons is that I wanted to express my profound gratitude to IRES, the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies at the University of Uppsala, that provides me the platform for this research and research on other topics such as poetry and politics, in which I organized the conference back in September. I am enormously grateful, and another reason is that this year has been Brodsky's year. Back in May he would have been 80. But the celebrations have been muted because of the pandemic, and this is one of the last occasions to pay a tribute to Brodsky still in this year. It's also a great honor to have as my discussant Professor Barry Scherr, who is a distinguished professor of Russian at Dartmouth College. The discussions on Brodsky's translations is a contested, highly contested subject, and discussions very often involve the arcana of Russian prosody and the presumed contrasts between Russian and English metrical systems, because Brodsky insisted on the preservation of meter and rhyme across translation. But actually Barry Scherr is one of the few people who knows something about those things. His 1986 book on the subject is a classic. He's a true expert, and I'm really honored to have him today. He's written his own analysis of Brodsky's work, which are very insightful. Recently he's told me, and I was able to include his memoirs in my book, that in 1970, as a young exchange student, he met Brodsky at his home in St. Petersburg, the famous Room and a Half. I'm also very delighted to have James Stotts here, a representative of a different generation, a very talented poet from Boston. He has also a very deep connection to Brodsky. He studied Russian because of him, went on several pilgrimages, and if you happen to discover his recent book, Elgin Pelicans, of poetry, you'll find out that Brodsky is one of his interlocutors. I started my research on Brodsky back in 2004, writing a doctoral thesis in English literature on a Russian-born poet, which seemed unusual at the time, especially since Brodsky's English has been the subject of criticism. Yet I had a very understanding supervisor and Professor West Pavlov, and I was also very lucky that in 2005 Brodsky's archives became available for researchers, and I was able to go through dozens of uncatalogued boxes and discover all sorts of things of them. Also, it was a blessing to interview many participants and players who played a great part in Brodsky's translations. I used comparative analysis of translation drafts delved into translation and versification theory, was the first to reconstruct the story behind translations, unearthing Brodsky's correspondence with the translators, and some of them approved, such as George Klein, and so did my dissertation commission. And in 2008, in Berlin, I was awarded summa cum laude, defended it with summa cum laude. But in 2008, I was already in my second year of my second graduate program, this time at the Slavic department at Yale. I wished to work under Thomas Wienslova, a poet and friend, and Brodsky scholar, and he also couldn't prize me from the archives at Yale, which I also in the years 2007, 2009 helped cataloging, making them more accessible for the future researchers. But this was a demanding graduate program at Yale, and so and in Germany there's a strange rule, probably ancient rule, that if you don't publish, you perish. If you don't publish within the 2 years of your defense, then you lose your degree. And so I was advised to publish my dissertation online on the university web page. It's a permanent thing, which was a mixed blessing, because into a year later, when I went to my first AAA double S and approached some of the publishers, they were reluctant to endorse a dissertation which was already most parts of it were all available online. So I was stuck in a limbo. But in the meantime, it started to have impact. In 2013, I was invited to a conference in Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland, and discovered that I had quite a following there among the young graduate students. Another colleague in 2012, she invited me to a conference and was very excited about my methods of comparative analysis, and she even got so excited that she forgot to change the title. In 2014, she brought out her book titled Brodsky Translating Brodsky, but it's clearly very different book, independent study. And also in 2014, I came to Uppsala for the first time for the historic conference organized by IRES, again, Julie Hansen and Susanne Witt, a huge translation conference, and Adrian Vanna, who in his keynote, he singled out my dissertation, which he has also, from which he has quoted in his recent book, The Bilingual Muse, which I highly recommend, not because he quoted me, but especially since I've moved along and my current book is very different, but I'm very grateful to him because he encouraged me to revise it into a book and was supportive of my work. So now in this new book, which is different from the dissertation I just said, I supplemented the technical things and technical analysis with a story, the story of an unlikely emergence of an English language poet born in Leningrad under Stalin, an English poet that could not be. And this is how the story is usually told. Brodsky was exiled from Russia on June 1972. He came to America, and so English translations became important for him. He commissioned, and several famous American poets offered their hand to translate his poems into English, but he was very demanding, he was very picky, and he wanted the form, the rhymes and meter to be also preserved across translation. And that's why he started interfering, reworking those translations, and eventually became his own translator. And this, many have argued, ought not to have happened. He was his own, he didn't have, he had Russian ear, his English was not up to the task, he was his own worst translator, the end of the story. And I say this is wrong. This is wrong because the story of Brodsky's English doesn't begin in America, but it begins in Russia. Brodsky was opposed to an excessive attention paid to trivial facts of his biography, of his life. He believed that the biography of a writer lies in a particular way he deals with words. But I believe this formula works both ways, and that some of the twists of his language can only be explained by the twists of his biography. God forbid if I wanted to write yet another tell-all biography of Brodsky, besides the already existing ones, of which there is a whole sea. What I set to do was to trace the genealogy of English Brodsky and to determine what made his attitude or relationship with English so unique. So at school as a young boy, curiously enough, Brodsky hated English because he performed poorly in it. And it might seem surprising, difficult to imagine that such a talented, obviously talented person for languages as Brodsky would perform so poorly. But in the Soviet schooling system under Stalin didn't exactly prioritize English language acquisition. The textbooks were full of ideological propaganda. And besides, as it turns out, he hated or was terrified by his English teacher, Sofia Isakovna, who was also Jewish like him. And then he mysteriously writes this sentence, a Jewish boy learning English from a Jewish woman. In my case, it was a losing proposition. Brodsky dwells on Sofia Isakovna's Russian Jewish accent in English, but says that it inspired him later in his life in his self-translation of one of his poems, twentieth, to come up with a rhyme, to rhyme the name of an African fly with the sound of a definite article in English, as if distorted by a Russian or Jewish accent. It seems curious that because Brodsky himself famously had a Jewish accent in Russian, his famous Jewish R, which became featured in several of his poems. Also in America, he had a Russian accent and, as some argue, wrote with a Russian accent. But it seems that here Brodsky is indirectly defending his Russian accent in English on the grounds that it allowed him to come up with an original, with a new rhyme in his second language. And those of you who remember his Auden essay, he sort of credited Auden with finding a new rhyme for love, which is very hard because there are very few beyond dove and glove, and Auden rhymed love with Diaghilev. And here Brodsky seems to claim the same thing for himself. Like many Jews of his generation, Brodsky had a Russian cultural identity for the reasons mentioned in the earlier slide. Actually, Fausto Malcovati, his Italian friend who met him in 1960s in Leningrad, was when I asked him about Brodsky, and he said, well, he was one of the many Jewish young men who were reciting, obsessed with poetry, Russian poetry, and reciting it at private gatherings. So Brodsky traced his infatuation to English back to a Russian literature class. And Michael Wachtel argued that anxiety, when one speaks about the golden age of Russian poetry, it's more appropriate to speak about the anxiety to be influenced rather than the anxiety of influence, like Harold Bloom did. And this is also true of Brodsky, who who insists on the inevitability of Byron's influence on Pushkin. But as I will explain shortly, this desire to be influenced went hand in hand with the desire in the opposite direction, namely of having an impact on Anglophone readers and poets. To begin with, in the first chapters of my book, I put Brodsky in the context of his generation that came to consciousness just in time for de-Stalinization. Their main mission became building bridges to the culture, Russia's pre-revolutionary culture or pre-World War I cosmopolitan culture. Poland became again their window to Europe, as at different periods of Russian history. They learned Polish because censorship restrictions in Poland were less strict than in the Soviet Union. And another path was drinking vodka with geniuses. This term was coined by a poet from the same generation, Yuna Moritz, who boasted of refusing to take part in it. And it referred to the practice of searching out and socializing with the surviving poets of the pre-revolutionary generation. And the two major poets were Boris Pasternak and Akhmatova, the survivors of Stalin's war against Russian culture, as in the words of Isaiah Berlin. And Thomas Venclova, who also drank vodka with geniuses and met Akhmatov even before he met Brodsky, believes that Brodsky inherited his Anglophone orientation from Akhmatova, who became a Pushkin scholar during the difficult period where she couldn't write her own poetry. And she tried to, she made a conscious effort to preserve European standards of culture against the Soviet tide. And Venclova argues that this was what helped her to endure the worst of Stalinist times. And the same goes also for Brodsky, that he discovered English poet John Donne, the metaphysical poet, and W.H. Auden, and wrote elegies in the manner of Frost and eulogized Eliot during his labor, confinement, his banishment in the Arctic Circle. So English also helped him to endure. And but Brodsky himself was reluctant to exhibit his wounds. He often denied having suffered at Nordinske, but James, who went there on a pilgrimage, knew better, and so he wrote in his poem, Brodsky poem, "How did you survive at all? How did your green eyes stay ever green?" And the answer is, again, that English language helped him in that endeavor. And in fact, we trace back his first ever poem written in English back to the time of his internal exile. My window is immoral kiss of white twilight. English poetic influence, especially that of Donne and the 17th century metaphysical poets, left an indelible imprint on Brodsky's poetics in terms of prosody, style, his topics, and it became the main source of poetic innovation. But there was also another element to it. Alexander Watt, the Polish Jewish poet, suggested that English influence helped Brodsky reinvigorate the stale Soviet poetic idiom, and later David Bethair concurred with this opinion. So later George Klein appeared on the horizon, American scholar and translator of poetry, and a year later Brodsky also met the Profes, who helped smuggle his poems outside Russia. Most crucially, Klein also managed to obtain a foreword for selected poems from Auden. So even before his forced immigration, the English destiny of his verse, not word, verse, that would have been a Brodsky pun, started to matter to Brodsky, as he put it in his letter, which was written months before his forced immigration on a short notice. He said, "English destiny of my verse is incredibly important. If one man in the States or England finds in my lines 1/10 of what I received from your poets, I'd be a lucky man, a lucky person." But so by this same token, we can say that when he was forced out of Russia and arrived to London in the company of Auden and was embraced by Auden and Stephen Spender, British audience also gave him a warm reception, even though he recited his poems in Russian. Robert Lowell volunteered to read the English translations. So in a way, the dream came true, but the dream was bittersweet. First, Brodsky was bitter because back home there was no such hall. Back home he was treated as an outcast, sent to prisons, mental asylums, denied publications. He was constantly, he and his house and friends were surveilled by the KGB. And now in the West, he feared that actually his muse might not survive transplantation, that in separation from his language, overheard on the street corners and in the streetcars, he might start forgetting Russian and cease to be a poet altogether. But a consolatory letter from Czesław Miłosz provided a vital psychological support. Miłosz dismissed it as a myth, as a Slavic myth, that the life of a writer ends if he abandons his native country. And so Brodsky soon developed a psychological stratagem which would later crystallize in his official stance on exile. He convinced himself and tried to convince others that his forced immigration from the Soviet Union had not changed, nor could have changed anything essential in his life, that his American life was merely a continuation of his former life in Leningrad. And most astonishingly, this also included his artistic medium, the language, as he wrote to his friends. America is just a continuation of space, and English language is merely a new set of phonetic synonyms. This is astonishing. What Brodsky was later accused by his critics, namely Russianizing English, was in fact all the way his strategy or his coping mechanism. And this was overlooked by everyone, including Miłosz himself, who 10 years later in '84 urged Brodsky to keep his Russian and American ways apart, which Miłosz did. But of course, Polish poetry and English poetry is different. There's not the musical component is maybe not as strong, or it's difficult. It's also a vague term, music, so maybe it's not an accurate statement. One way or another, sort of already in his first statement, in his first poetry review on American soil, Brodsky fused his Russian predilections and Russian sensibility with his profound knowledge and understanding of English language poetry. And review was dedicated to the American poet Richard Wilbur, whom he praised for his technical skill, and immediately launched an all-out attack on free verse, on any form of free verse, which he declared to be less functional than a regular meter and exact rhymes. Brodsky was declaring war on a certain brand of modernism dominating American poetry at the time. Characteristically, Brodsky twice used the term word resistance in that review. He was a sworn enemy of the avant-garde, and this was both aesthetic and political position, as one German friend of him, Christoph Buch, so succinctly summarized. He said Brodsky was not aiming at the disintegration of form, but at the restoration of the richness of traditional art. And this was a declaration of war on totalitarian state, not through political protest, but through aesthetic dissent. And such views were perceived in 1970s America as conservative, where formal poetry was not fashionable, and formal poets like Richard Wilbur were already on the retreat. But Brodsky himself would probably have preferred Tynyanov's term, an archaist innovator. And the whole issue of form became the main sticking point between Brodsky and his translators. Brodsky was very doctrinaire about it, and well, as he stated in his first review of Akhmatova's translations, he said that loss in poetry translation is inevitable, but the meter has to be preserved, and the rhymes and the meaning, all the elements together. And 25 years later already, after he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, Brodsky didn't budge, didn't change his position, and in his letter to his Swedish publisher, he argued that the minimum requirement is to preserve the meter. I'd rather appear stiff than spineless, and it would be also nice if rhymes survived as well. And of course, Swedish he didn't know, and the stakes were obviously much higher for English. However, Brodsky himself didn't always practice what he preached. Brodsky's self-translations, or rather his reworkings of Klein's initial drafts, approximate more closely the rhythmical realizations of Russian original, rather than produce an equivalent of its metrical scheme. When Brodsky spoke of meter, what he actually had in mind was the real rhythm of his poems, with all the peculiarities of Russian phonetic realization. Besides this equimetrical method that Brodsky was pushing, was very inefficient and time-consuming. Even such a master of poetic form as Auden, who was Brodsky's main poetic model, and approached translation and Russian translation in very similar way as Brodsky, confessed that he said that the question of preserving the Russian rhythms and rhymes is frightfully difficult. And Auden had only translated Woznесensky with the help of Hayward, Max Hayward. And Brodsky is arguably a much more complex poet, so more difficult to translate. And Derek Walcott told me an anecdote about revising, going over the final stages, the proofs of Brodsky's first American collection, A Part of Speech, in 1979, and recorded Brodsky's own exasperation that in 6 hours he was only able to translate 3 lines of his poem. And another interesting example is Richard Wilbur's translation of Brodsky's poem 6 years later, which Brodsky's associates unanimously declared as exemplary translation of a Brodsky poem into English, a miracle of adaptation. Wilbur tirelessly worked for an entire month on this 36-line long poem, and he not only produced a masterpiece in English, but also vindicated, as it were, Brodsky's approach that it was possible to preserve both the music and the meaning of the Russian across translation. But Brodsky still, sort of helped by Walcott, still chose to alter even this impeccably crafted translation. In the last 2 lines of the poem, Wilbur allowed himself he came up with this travail. The whole poem is written in pentameter, and Wilbur added here 2 lines in hexameter, 6 feet instead of 5. And I'm saying that he produced almost dactylic lines. Somehow it would appear we drifted right on through it into the future, into the night. And Brodsky changed it. But I argue that by challenging a master in English, Brodsky claimed or presumed to claim some of their territory, or at least try to show that he belonged to the same league, to the same club. And Brodsky's Dantesque poem, December in Florence, is also a very fascinating example. I call it a self-translation with a multitude of sources. Brodsky not only availed himself of Robert Lowell's translation of the poem, but also of 3 other English language translators, but he dismissed them all, took some elements from all of them and produced his own version. And very interestingly, Brodsky sort of gave very precise, exacting instructions about what effect he wanted his verse meter, the accentual verse, Dolnik, to produce on English readers. But according to Barry Scherr, this highly innovative verse meter was based on Anglophone models. However, Brodsky was, in the last stanza, which Brodsky reworked more substantially, Brodsky gets the closest to the style of his later self-translations, which were most strongly criticized. And I argue that he was developing a bilingual sensibility, and the translation mimics in most impressive ways the movements, the syntactic units of the original, and sort of reproducing the sound of Russian. The correspondences in each of the quoted lines are of a different kind. In the first line, it's the movement of the caesuras. In the second half line, the parallelism and the imagery, the similarity between the vowels employed in both languages. In the fourth line, it's a number of stress syllables matched by the correspondence in the imagery. Similarly, in the line 5, there is parallelism between the consonants as employed in English and Russian, места устами, and onomatopoeic correspondence in the 8th line. Brodsky was able to create authentic harmonies in English, even though those harmonies were largely based on Russian phonetic principles. One reason for such drastic experiments was that the delivery of his poetry was extremely important for Brodsky. Weisbert observed that when Brodsky recited his own poems, he projected them as highly formal structures, but he questioned, Weisbert asked whether it was some sort of trick or illusion involved in here. But for me, what's important to me is that Brodsky's ability to impact and control his audience was a part of his poetic experience in Russia, albeit this happens at private gatherings, unofficial gatherings. But the same thing, so this impact on his audience served to guarantee his self-worth as a poet, also in his new home. And now, if you allow me, I'd like to play a short 40 seconds excerpt of Brodsky reading his own poem before I move to my conclusions. Here we go.
Roman elegies to Benedetta Cravieri. The captive mahogany of a private Roman flat. In the ceiling, a dust-covered crystal island. At sunset, the window panes pan a common ground for the nebulous and the iron. Setting a naked foot on the rosy marble, the body steps towards its future, to its attire. If somebody shouted freeze, I'd perform that marvel, as the city happily did in its childhood hour.
And now back to the PowerPoint and to my conclusions. Poetry for Brodsky was a dialogue with his predecessors, but to guarantee his self-respect as a poet in a new country, he also needed to win over his contemporaries. His reputation of being persecuted at home and later exiled, endorsed first by Akhmatova and then by Auden, preceded him. Yet to rely on that alone would have been too easy. He wanted to contribute to his own survival as a poet in exile, to earn his reputation himself in his new linguistic milieu. It involved exploiting his ability to captivate audiences with his skillful melodic recitations. It involved making his peers notice his extraordinary command of his adopted language. It involved showing his knowledge of the secrets of poetic craft. It was this, and not just an accurate or faithful translation of his poems, that Brodsky had to achieve to feel truly at home in his adopted country. His English translators helped him to achieve this goal, but have been also the unsung victims of his poetic ambition. Whatever could not be achieved through his command of his adopted language alone was compensated by his charm, the sheer force of personality, as well as his powers of persuasion. His actual English translations and poems could be thus regarded almost as a bonus, a byproduct of this larger self-translation of Joseph Brodsky from Leningrad into Joseph Brodsky, the poet laureate of the United States of America. No wonder he was not interested in translating his poems written in English back into Russian. His long and winding road of becoming an English language author started in Leningrad classroom with a huge portrait of Joseph Stalin hovering over the blackboard, where a Jewish boy could not learn English from a Jewish woman. This was followed by decades of passionate self-study of English, absorption, imitation, and translation of English language poetic models into Russian, and later of his own poems into English. His transplantation, which he interpreted as a continuation of space, where English became merely a continuation of Russian into a continuation of Russian by other poetic means, resulted in the unique process of translating his poetry into English, as well as in occasional poems and essays written directly in his second language. In the end, by applying his charisma, genius, and persuasion, he became by hook or by crook a part of speech in English as well as in Russian. What gets left of a man amounts to a part, to his spoken part, to a part of speech. And last but not least, my new book will include interviews with all those people who also contribute with their own perspective on this contested topic. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay, here we go. You survived. All right, what's...
Okay. Zakhar, should I get started or?
Yeah, that would be
okay.
Lovely. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, so my task here is to offer a bit of commentary, maybe start some of the discussion. And I should say at the outset that I received, I guess, one chapter directly from your book, the one on George Klein, an article that you had published on Weisbort and Brodsky, as well as the Benjamin article that you published. So I have a little bit of background that maybe not everybody is going to have, and I'll comment a little bit on that. So first thing I want to say is that very much enjoyed your presentation today, and based also on my reading, I think it's going to be a fascinating book for those with any interest in Brodsky or translation for that matter. What's really wonderful is all that material you get out of the archives, and you watch the development of the translations from the original versions, but particularly in the case of Klein. Step one by Klein, Brodsky makes a few comments, Klein comes back, Brodsky comes back with more comments, and they work back and forth. And finally, Brodsky just grabs it and makes of it what he will. So just watching that process, watching the poet work with the translator is really quite fascinating. Gives you some wonderful insights into Brodsky. And as you pointed out today, for Brodsky, certain aspects of the poem were very important. The formal nature of poetry is key to him. But what he tries to keep, of course, tends to vary. And again, based on the examples that I've seen now, it's quite striking. The phonetic aspect of it that he tries to get across in English, which some translators seem to get here and there and sometimes don't, but he does work in that fairly consistently. The rhyme words are very important to Brodsky. And he emphasizes this very strongly in the chapters I saw, that in many instances, not in all, it's I think impossible to do it consistently, he'll come up with rhyme words in English that have the exact meaning as the rhyme words back in the original Russian. So trying to grab that, putting significant words there. So this is, again, one of the things that Brodsky pays a lot of attention to. And the rhythm of the original, vitally important to Brodsky, not just meter, but the rhythm, the flow, his sense of how the work is supposed to read in the original, again, remains very important to him. He's also, it's very striking, does take liberties with his own translations, as you noted. There are a couple of passages that I saw where, I mean, Brodsky does things in his translations that I would never dare to do if I were translating a poem myself. I think, as you point out, at least one place, it's as the poet who wrote the original, I think he felt a certain liberty to do things that most translators might want to avoid. I think in that last stanza A Second Christmas by the Shore, the translation he worked on with Klein, he throws in this little added phrase, splinter boardwalks, which is not at all in the original. It's like adding a whole other concept that's there, which is quite interesting. But also a very interesting thing about the translations by Brodsky. And I don't know if this is necessarily an improvement or not, but often his Russian becomes a little clearer when you read the English, because you know he puts into his English translations what it is that he wanted to say. And again, it's something that you bring out a couple of times as you're analyzing his work on these poems. So a couple of things that really do strike me, and based on today's presentation and also on my readings. First of all, this very vision of English, of his time in America, of his work in English as a continuation of his work in Russian. That's pretty unusual for a poet, I think. I mean, certainly other poets have helped with translations of their poems into another language. It's not that unusual if the poet knows a second language. But Brodsky really saw his work in English as part of a line that was going forward. And as you were talking today, I couldn't help but think for a little bit about my late colleague at Dartmouth, Lev Losov, who was a great friend of Brodsky and wrote that biography of Brodsky, edited the 2-volume edition of Brodsky's poems, knew him back in Leningrad in the old days. And so Lev Losov comes to the States, becomes somewhat of a poet himself, actually a fairly well-known poet in Russian. And his attitude toward Russian and English is exactly the opposite of Brodsky's. I mean, he agreed with Brodsky in just about everything except for that. I mean, Losov wrote more than once that he felt you could not really translate his poems into English. It just wasn't going to happen. And he said to his close friend, Jerry Smith, who has translated quite a bit of Lev Losov's poetry. They said, these are, good works you've created and all that. They're accurate, but they're basically, they're not my poems. They're something else. And Losov, whose knowledge of English, I would say, certainly by the end of his life, was no worse than Brodsky's, never worked with somebody else directly, even answer questions about translations, but he didn't really try to alter them or work on them himself. He kept his English and his Russian totally separate, or at least as separate as he could, and spent a lot of time, in fact. I remember back in the old days, before it was as easy as it is today to just listen to current Russian, he'd be watching these Russian TV broadcasts, just keeping up that Russian ear. And Brodsky, again, has this very different attitude toward it all. So it's really quite an unusual aspect of Brodsky, and something that you capture very, very well. Something I thought you didn't bring out as much today, but it's worth mentioning, I guess, is working with his translators. You do talk about this a little bit, but he seems to regard, as his English gets better and better, maybe even before he gets better and better, he tends to regard these translations produced, with great effort as kind of drafts that he can just do with whatever he wants almost. In some cases, I think you point out with Wilbur, he keeps really most of the original. He doesn't really play with it that much. But a lot of cases, Klein being a prime example, Weisbord, in that description, and by the way, I've read Weisbord's book, that From Russian with Love, I read a number of years ago. And Weisbord was really kind of, I don't know, unhappy, let's say, about his interactions with Brodsky finally, although he does try to disguise that a bit in his book, I think, but it's pretty clear. And certainly in the part that you publish on him, it's really quite striking that Weisbord regarded those translations as his original work in a way. And Brodsky just kind of does with it what he will. And I can see why Brodsky was unhappy with some of those translations. For Brodsky, for whom rhyme was so important, Weisbord, and some of his particularly early drafts, the what he calls approximate or slant rhymes or whatever, it's really hard to see any relationship between the rhyme words in some of those cases. And Brodsky was more concerned, at least some sound similarity be brought out. And Brodsky, I would say, probably had a better feel for what was going to work as rhyme in English than Weisbord did. So that was really quite striking. But But Brodsky's treatment of these people was really somewhat high-handed, I have to say. And I find myself feeling very sorry for poor George Klein, who seems to have gotten treated badly at various times. In fact, I have a vague question for you. I was always puzzled as to why, when that huge book of collected poems in English came out, and maybe this was the editor, because Brodsky had passed away by then, the decision was not to include that whole chunk of work that came out in selected poems, that first book that brought Brodsky to fame in English. The translations in that book, it turns out, are just the ones that Brodsky oversaw in English, and it published in book form with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. So you get this huge chunk of really Brodsky's early poetry, including many of the ones that made him famous in English, are not there. And struck me as an odd situation. I didn't know if his final attitude toward Klein's translations was that negative or not, but just an interesting little item to think about there. Brodsky, again, his concern is always with creating in English what he feels are the most important aspects of the poem. And I think that a lot of cases this works extremely well. I think that his work with Klein, based on what he does with Second Christmas by the Shore, really resulted in better translations. I mean, Klein's were not bad, I thought, but Brodsky does find ways to improve them and to capture a bit more of the original, and particularly the central idea of the original. So he's really extremely good at doing that. At other times I was a little bit less sure. That last line of 6 years later, and Wilbur has "I'm through it into the future, into the night." I couldn't write down all the lines quickly enough here as you're speaking. The line that comes out in Brodsky is "through them into the future, into the night." I thought that the Brodsky version is a little bit less rhythmic, and that "into the future, into night" didn't work as well for me as "into the future, into the night" that Wilbur actually had there. So once in a while, I feel that I don't know, what Brodsky is trying to bring across in English maybe doesn't work quite as well as it might have. But he does, and this again is a key point that you're making. He really wants to create an English poetry, or at least his English poetry, his English translations, that are again a continuation of his Russian in some way. It's a very important point in understanding what it is that he is finally trying to do with that, with all those translations. And I'll throw in one personal anecdote to highlight that. One day, I mean, you know, as you mentioned, I did meet with Brodsky on 2 evenings back in the old Soviet Union in his apartment, which was not yet famous as room and a half. But in the States, I got to know him again through Lev Losov after a bit of an interval. He did not remember those earlier meetings, but that was okay. But we chatted a couple times about poetry, and one day out of the blue, he calls me up, and he's starting to read this Gerard Manley Hopkins poetry to me. And he says, you know, "Isn't this the way it sounds in English?" And he gives it to me. It was sort of like the Brodsky reading you just did, this very heavy Russian accented English. I think it sounded, the Russian accent was heavier when he started to read the poetry than it was when he was speaking English. And hitting the stressed syllables in a way that I'm sure Hopkins never intended them to be hit. And I was trying to explain this to Brodsky, and he would not accept it, of course. And that was one of the reasons why I always felt that, to some extent, Brodsky's own version of sprung rhythm, what Hopkins came up with, which came into this very unusual type of Dominique verse, very kind of a regular type of writing later in his life, but still very controlled at the same time. I often felt that his reading of English verse, in some ways, came to inspire some of his own work. But this back and forth between English and Russian for Brodsky is really one of the most fascinating aspects of his career, and one I think you've brought out more effectively than anybody has up until now. Well, I should probably just stop with that and throw it open for some discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Barry. I don't know whether I should respond or other people should chip in. Well, it was very, you did a great job and brought all the important points there. Well, of course, the dissertation was about the translations, and also the book deals with the translation, but I argued that the translators kind of helped, whom he used as, whose works as half-finished products helped to bring about this phenomenon. So he owes them, and they're the unsung victims, but not all of them minded too much, apart from Weisbord, or dared to protest. I don't know. We have maybe somebody else wants to chip in, or there is James, there is Irena.
Yeah.
There is Melissa, I've seen. Maybe she wants to say something. You have to unmute yourself, Melissa. Oops.
Thank you. I'm just all ears. I have nothing to say. Hi, Cynthia.
Thank you so much.
Sorry.
No worries. Sorry for putting you on the spot.
That's okay.
Okay. So who wants to say something next? Oh, there is Timothy.
Timothy, yeah, you can go, please. You unmute yourself.
Oops.
At first, ladies and gentlemen, I was finding that the host is not allowing one to unmute. The host, I got that error message, so we must be aware of that. Are you all hearing me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Greetings all. Привет всем. I have a question basically for Zakhar and Barry. Does anyone know whether Jerry Smith has had interesting interactions or had the opportunity to interact with Brodsky on this very topic of equirhythmical or equimetrical translation between English and Russian? The question occurs to me because, Zakhar, of your vocabulary, which was in a way very, well, you are following Brodsky in this very traditional locution, the locution of preserving in translation various formal qualities of the poetic original. And I never tire of remarking to colleagues and students that there is no such preservation. And I'm fond of invoking Shakespeare: nothing of him that doth remain, but that suffers a sea change into something rich and strange. The verse translation is something rich and strange. Those are corals that were his eyes. Even the idea of preserving vowel qualities and certain consonantalism between the original and a verse translation is very, very problematic. And the scholar who I think is most sensitive to the problem of the nistikovka, the lack of coordination between the semantic auras of a given a meter in one language and the same meter in the language of translation, that is Jerry Smith. And it seems that Brodsky's practice disregards or brackets that entire problematic. And did Jerry and Brodsky ever discuss this, ever ventilate the difference in their approaches to that problem?
I have no idea, but maybe Barry.
You know, I'm not actually sure. I'm in touch with Jerry quite often about various topics, and you know, he's been translating. I mentioned my colleague Lev Losov. He's been translating Lev Losov's poetry, kind of as a hobby, I think, the last several years. You know, he published that book of his translations a while ago, but he's been translating other poems since then. And he does try in those translations, I have to say, Jerry does, for staying rather as close as he can to the original. You know, he does try to produce some effect of rhyme, some effect of the original meter. You know, he finds areas that he feels are fairly close to the original in some ways, or would be an equivalent in English. I mean, you're right, of course. There's no way that anything you do in translation is going to be exactly the same as in the original. You know, the context is simply so different. And yet, by the way, Brodsky didn't really accept that, as you know. He I think there's a line that, I think he really felt that meter, for example, was just an automatic, easy translation. Iambic pentameters, iambic pentameters, iambic pentameter.
But of course they're not. They're not. In the originating culture, they're not. And in the receiving culture, they're not. And adjusting an extra hexameter back down to a pentameter, that kind of metrical liberty would simply be granted according to a less, I would say, naive, dare I say it, attitude toward the translatability of poetic form. Pasternak was the same. Pasternak did not recognize the value of any translations of his own work that were not metrical.
Yeah.
Well,
but I think that's Brodsky's choice, is to really say that there's certain elements that he feels are particularly important to preserve. And by the way, in preserving one, he often loses something of the other. In that line where he decides he has to keep up the same meter as his original, he actually, or the same length, I would say, he keeps the line length, but he loses some of the rhythmic quality that's in Wilbur's translation. So he'll decide at different moments that a certain aspect of his poem is most important to him. And again, with the rhyme words, it's quite interesting too. Of course, the rhymes are totally different, and the sounds of the words are going to be different. But I think in Brodsky's case particularly, when he's rhyme, not in every poem that he does, but very often, his rhyme words carry a lot of the meaning of the poem itself, or at least he sees them as being the key words to the poem. So he wants those key words there, and he'll work on doing that. So therefore, in those instances, what's important to him primarily is that you get that key word at the very end of the line, in a way that's probably even more important than in English, where you don't have that much rhyme poetry anymore. So he'll pick out what to him is important for that particular poem, and try to keep that, even if he loses something else along the way. And I think that's where Brodsky sees himself, as the owner of the original, as the person who has the ability and the right to manipulate and decide what it is that has to be brought into English. But yes, of course, and getting back to your original point, 1 meter, it might be some, actually with English and Russian, there are some analogs in some ways, a lot of unrhymed iambic pentameter in 19th century English as well as in Russian poetry. But they're not the same, clearly. No 2 meter can be. But Brodsky, again, he experimented with his Russian meters, and I think he felt that in English he could do a lot of the same thing and play with it in certain ways, and that was maybe bringing across some of the same effect.
Thank you. I think Irena wanted to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to say that, first of all, I read your book, and I was really incredibly impressed with it. It's really very, very interesting and very well written, and it reads fantastically. It kind of brings up things that are between the gossip and literal analysis, which is really wonderful. That is, that we read, we meet the people, and we see the battles about texts. I found it really great. And I want to say that for me, this whole thing is monumental. That is the fight of Brodsky to be a poet in the new language. It's it's a very, very unusual thing, because most of the poets and many poets I spoke to are simply unable to do it. It's a question of a very rare ability. And he, if you read, if you look at what he did with the first foreign language in which he worked, that is Polish, the interesting thing is that immediately, as soon as he started to study it, he started to write little poems in it. And there are several little poems that remained in letters to friends. Just kind of immediately started to possess it through kind of funny little poems. And here he did this too in English, but with English, it was the real love affair of, you know, the love of the life, simply. So it's, I remember that when I was looking at his efforts to do it, I was incredibly hopeful, because I thought, mistakenly as it seems, I don't know, that this is going to be truly welcome, and it is the sign of a new approach to kind of more multilingual approach to poetry. And this kind of barrier that was put against his incursion into English was a real shock to me. Because if you look at it from the point of view, especially of people like me, that is of the people who live in a foreign language, that this was a really splendid effort to domesticate the new territory. And the fact of this very, very brutal attack against him was very dispiriting. So this is what I wanted to say. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you very much.
Cool. May I? A few things?
Go ahead.
Sure. So thank you very much, Zach, for letting me be a part of this. I was able to actually get the entire book chapter by chapter, so everybody knows, and I was helping him edit it through, so I've read the whole thing.
I wanted to mention it. It was in my script, but I forgot. Sorry. I'm very grateful.
But if anybody does want to speak, because a lot of people don't even have their cameras on, or we won't be able to see you physically raising your hand, just press the raise hand button and I'll kind of be looking on the side. But yeah, Zach and I met, I went down to New York when I was living in Boston to go to a poetry reading with my brother that was Tadeusz Dąbrowski, the Polish poet, and Glenn Maxwell, the British poet. And afterwards we went out and had dinner and drank vodka. And that was the first time we met. That was probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
And since then, we've met a couple more times. And then I read his first book and then this one. And what I think is special about this book, which when people get to read it and they'll see, is that the biography we have now of Joseph Brodsky is that Lev Losov one. And it covers everything about Joseph Brodsky's life in Russia really well until he came here. And then there's a whole lot that's left out about the work that he did here in America. And there was nothing else to like fill that in, like the way that he worked with Richard Wilbur and Eric Walcott, and etc., and the other friendships that he had, and the development of his poetry afterwards. And this book does all of that work that had never been done, and not just by like looking what's there on the page, but also because of all the interviews that he was able to do, that Zach was able to do. What I wonder, and this will be my question to you, Zach, is after he died in 96, because Joseph Brodsky was so proprietary with his translations, translation of his work has effectively stopped. And now that's been almost 25 years. And there have been people working on the translations, but very little of it has been published, and people working on it on their own can't publish it. So what do you think the next step is for, because not all of his work is translated. We have the collected poems in English, but that's not close to the complete poems.
Well, I think you should, thank you so much. Thank you so much for reading, being my first reader and giving the feedback and encouraging me. And thank you for being here today. And I think the question should be addressed to Anne Schellberg, his literary executor, who was promised or threatened to be here. No, promised. She has been incredibly helpful and supportive, and actually brought us all together. She introduced me to Irene, she introduced me to James, and she helped me, made me aware of all the archives, and introduced me to the Barry Rubin and other people I was able to interview. But it's I think there is a will, and you know, as you saw this letter to Swedish publisher, which seems to be like also a sort of will, you know, translating will. I'd rather be non-existent in Swedish than non-rhymes, not meters. I'm sort of, you know.
Zach,
Yeah.
there is Maria here is.
I asked her whether she wanted to say something, but I don't know whether she wants to be.
About translations.
I know. I just asked her, but now I don't see her anymore. Maybe she has left.
No, she's here.
Yeah.
She's there. There she is.
Oh yeah. Maria, would you like to say something?
Well, as you know, can you hear me? I don't know whether I've unmuted.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not native Russian and I'm not native English, so I feel kind of odd in this. But I thought actually I'm well placed to make a small explanation.
I'm gonna
to read one of Joseph's poems alternatively in Russian and English, mixing the stanzas, English and Russian, in one of Joseph's own translations. Perhaps that should speak for itself. It will basically, I think, summarize a bit everything that everyone has said today, and show this incredible effort of love, really, that he did towards the English language and towards the English speaking people. So anyway, I just chose one of a short one, and perhaps I won't read all the stanzas. Can't see terribly well. I hope you can hear me. Не важно, что было вокруг, и не важно, о чем там пурга завывала протяжно, что тесно им было в пастушей квартире, что места другого им не было в мире. No matter what went on around them, no matter what message the snowstorm was starting to utter, or how crowded they thought that wooden affair, or that there was nothing for them anywhere. Во-первых, они были вместе, второе. И главное было, что их было трое, и все, что творилось, варилось, дарилось, от дней как минимум на 3 делилось. First they were together, and then, most of all second, they now were a threesome. Whatever was reckoned, the stuff they were brewing, accruing, receiving was bound to be split into 3 like this evening. It's an incredible, I think it does summarize what Zakhar said, what Barry said, what Irena said. I'm not going to read the whole thing also because it makes me too emotional to read something in public of Joseph's, but I really don't think there's anything to add to that. Do you?
Well, there is, as Timothy brought up this point, and there was also a famous letter, attempt of defense by Nadezhda Mandelstam of Robert Lowell from Nabokov's attacks, and she sort of, it's a manifesto almost of freedom, of translating freedom. And she says, you know, poems of a big poem belong to everyone, and the only way to criticize the translation to do it yourself. And she sort of says, you know, everything is permitted on one way, but then 5 years later, and people have commented on this and it has been published, but 5 years later, she in a way retracted, because she says, well, it's very difficult to write poems within tradition, as she's saying, as Mandelstam did. And Tsvetaeva thought she could write like him, but she was mistaken. And she says, well, Lowell's translations are very free, Paul Celan's translations are very free, but this particular British translator, Green, I don't even remember his name, who tried to preserve the word that Timothy hates, preserve the formal aspects of it, then these are the best translators. And I think it's a cultural thing, and for Russians, it's very difficult to to imagine their poetry being translated without this music. But on the other hand, as we hear from the native speakers, you know, there are all sorts of ways, and language evolves, and maybe there are different ways of translating Russian poetry, and including Brodsky.
And of course, I mean, I exaggerated the meter while reading. You could do it more subtly, especially in English, right? I didn't have to be so precise on the meter.
No, I think you did a great job.
And the other thing is, yes, free verse, but I don't know whether you said it because I arrived a little late. I was teaching, and unfortunately missed the beginning of your discussion. But Joseph used to argue about free verse and would ask, yes, but free from what?
Mm-hmm.
You know, free from what? If you can answer that, you pretty much get his answer.
Okay, there's someone.
Zakhar, let me follow up on what James asked just a moment ago. The lack of new works by Brodsky in English, at least, the lack of appearance. You met with George Klein at one point, and Anne Schoberg, in your editor's note, when the collected poems came out, I just picked it up, and she writes that the present volume will also be supplemented by 2 collections of translations now in preparation. That's back in 2000. Yeah. First, a new expanded edition of Joseph Brodsky's selected poems, translated by George L. Klein, and which will include more of the poems the author, and which includes more of the poems the author wrote in the Soviet Union before his emigration in 1972. So apparently, a new edition of was supposed to be being prepared by George Klein, and nothing ever happened. Did George ever mention that to you? Was he working on it, or did anybody know what happened with that?
All of this is going to be put together. There's a huge thing coming out. It's taking a very long time, unfortunately. Yes, and I'm sorry for the English reader, but there is going to be an edition, and it's annotated and everything, and it is coming out. I don't know. I don't want to say a date because other things have been added to, of course, George Klein's. George Klein's are coming out. There are a lot of things in preparation, both in English and in Russian. And yes, and it's a huge job. And Anne Schoberg is very thorough, and she's taking her time, making sure.
Okay, thank you.
As perfect as it can be.
Okay, there's also Bang, there is Denise, Bang, yeah, would you like to say something?
I would like to say, coming back to Barry's comments about the translations, that he would find things in the translations such an ordinary translator wouldn't dare to do. And that's obvious because, after all, both the translation and the original is for Joseph an original. We have to do with two originals. We had an agreement. I asked him, for example, when the metaphor in the English translation is totally different than the one in the Russian original, can I choose which is easier for me when I translate into Swedish? Of course, it's both my metaphors, he said. I just had to change it into English because I couldn't do it in another way. So actually, sometimes we had discussions. I remember calling him once and said, well, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm translating this poem, and so am I. You are translating it into English, and I'm translating it into Swedish. And I have difficulties translating ni pucha ni pera. Well, so do I, he said. So he changed it totally. I couldn't do that as a translator, but he did it, of course, yeah. So I just want to say that, for example, when he adds in the Florence poem, sluggish, which is not in the Russian original, it's because that's a possible development of the imagery, so to speak, right? So, well, that's only what I wanted to say. As to his idea that one should use rhymes and meter as far as possible, of course, this is difficult in any language, but I think one should try at least to do it. And I'm happy that Joseph's Swedish was worse than his English, so he wouldn't have anything to say about my translations. He had to, so to speak, accept that they were more or less good after all. And that's why the letter was written to his publisher, actually, because he would never accept a translation from somebody who didn't even try to rhyme or to keep the meter. And this put his publisher in a very difficult situation because he had to refuse translations that were not rhymed. And this was very difficult. So when I was in America, I asked Joseph, you have to write a letter to the publisher to give him some kind of power of attorney to turn down translations that do not follow these rules.
So thank you so much, Bengt. Anybody else who wants to make a comment? Denise, yeah.
Yes. What can I say, Zakhar? I should start from, I haven't read Ishov, but I'm
That's
waiting for reading this.
Oh, thank you.
Actually, I would like to note one thing, because you told about this, and I think it's curious. I mean, when they start to say that reading Joseph Brodsky auto translations can help us to understand better his Russian poems, it's true from one side, but from the other side, I remember this, this famous case of his poem «Я входил вместо дикого зверя в клетку», where this, I cannot understand why he did it, because in Russian version we can read «трижды тонул, дважды бывал распорот». And in English, in auto translation, you remember that it's twice have drowned, thrice let knives rake my nitty-gritty. And this is no, phonetical reasons to, to change twice and thrice, but he did it. So it's tricky. I mean, his auto translations, it's a little bit new, or edited poems, but reading research like yours, reading books like yours, actually helping to us, because I remember when I prepared my paper about December in Florence, I read your article about this. I have no idea what is in the new book, what is not included, but this piece about December in Florence was really helpful, because you can see how he's working with translation, and what sometimes you can see what he meant in Russian, but sometimes it's, you know, foggy. So thanks, and I'm waiting. I'm eager to read. I promise to send you my book that should, you know, came out this week about Joseph Brodsky and Anna Akhmatova, and let's exchange.
Yeah, exchange. Sounds good.
And I'm happy to see so many, you know, familiar faces. So hi all.
Okay, so somebody else. Cynthia wants to defend. No, defend Klein. She declines. Okay, I think John Narins wants to join.
I'm having. Can you hear me? I'm having a little trouble with the sound.
Yeah.
No. Okay. I seemed. Okay. If you can hear me, that's good enough. As somebody who writes and publishes verse in both Russian and English, and with some substantial translation and scholarly experience, I find this extremely interesting. And I just had a few comments I wanted to share. One of the things that when we were talking about the, I mean, Barry was talking in particular about things that we gain and things that we lose when we're making these choices and what to preserve. That I hear you also. Can somebody say something?
Yes.
No, I seem to be missing your sound. Well, anyway, so make a visual sound if there's something that I need to, a visual sign. Okay, very good, thank you. One of the things that was missing in that conversation, I thought, was style, and I think style is extremely important because, well, obviously, when you try to maintain rhymes, when you try to, which is something that's obviously happening very often in Brodsky's conversations with his translators, that often comes at the expense of style. And yet, obviously, style is fantastically important for what made Brodsky Brodsky. And in fact, it's important for meter, because when we have, and this goes also to the whole issue of preserving meter, because when a style is particularly conversational, when we have a lot of idioms, for example, they roll faster, where they're very internalized. They can be very complex rhythmically, and yet they come very, very quickly. Style, they change the way meter works. I did think that a lot of that was in fact lost in some of the examples that we're studying, that we discussed today. And that makes the discussions of style very important, and it complicates discussions of maintaining meter. I think that obviously when you start at a very general level, and Brodsky talks about it's important that you have rhyme and meter, it's a very different discussion than whether you maintain the exact rhyme and meter that he originally had. And when Timothy was talking about the things about metrical auras and things like that, and maintaining those things also, I have to say that it's important to read, I think, the poetic canon with a view toward finding exceptions to it, because I think the most obvious example usually used in Russian is we're talking about amphibrachs and their connection to some certain humorous verses. But if you read through the Russian, there are tons of examples where amphibrachs do exactly the opposite. It's connected to style, it's connected to context, and these things are very, very difficult. And I think that actually, it makes a lot of sense. I can understand Brodsky's view in terms of a translation, as the translation is meant to convey him. And so if a translator is doing something that's not conveying him, there's an extent to when you have a living author who has a capability to understand what's going on to a certain degree. I can understand, I think I agree with his notion that he ought to interfere to make sure, and as a translator also, I would do the same thing. I would always appeal to, I think translators don't ask enough questions. I would appeal to and I would want there are ways, there's a whole artistic aspect of this, how you talk to an original author if you're a translator, how you talk to a translator as an author, so that each participant uses the other in such a way as to, there's a level of trust, obviously, in the language of the translator, and there's a level of trust in the understanding of the original. So yeah, those are basically some of the things that I wanted to mention. I think that there's a notion of a sense of rhythm that that one can hear that may go beyond simple studies of metrical history and associations. Anyway, that was probably long enough. But thank you. It's a fascinating thing. Well, no, sorry, one tiny last thing. It also, what Barry was saying, that you can understand the Russian better. That was actually a fascinating comment. I found the same thing when I was looking at translations of Nabokov. You begin to understand what he did know about what was going on in the translation, and what he didn't know about what was going on in the translation. But that's wonderful, because we want to understand the originals, right? I mean, I think it's a fascinating thing. So anyway, thank you very much. It was the whole thing has been fascinating.
Okay, thank you. That was John Narens, right? That's how he's a poet. Well, the very short comment is, you know, to what you're saying. For instance, Brodsky was critical of Anthony Hecht's translation of his poem, Lullaby of Cape Cod, because he added some 90 lines of something. But, you know, okay, but we have a poem in English which was admired, which was, which sort of gained them some fame. And lots of people, native speakers, say, well, this is a nice poem. On the other hand, and Hecht said, you know, if I wanted to squeeze it all in your meter like you wanted, it wouldn't have worked. And on the other hand, there is, you know, whenever I mention at conference, I was the last one, the pre-pandemic was in San Diego, sorry. And the young scholar, you know, as soon as I mentioned Brodsky's self-translations, he just started laughing, and it doesn't work, and it's such a, it has such a bad reputation. So how do we sort of negotiate between these two extremes? Well, some things work, but some things are sort of on the verge of not coming across in English as
yeah, no, I think that's very true. I think, I mean, both Brodsky and Nabokov were extremely dictatorial in this, in the sense that on the one hand, I think you can have, and as a both as a poet and as a translator, I have a lot of sympathy for the notion that they ought to have a big say in making sure that what they say gets through. That is sort of a Gadamer's sort of notion of transparency is the role of a translator. But on the other hand, they may have had, without going into the arguments, somewhat exaggerated notions of their grasp of certain aspects of the target language. And it's important to know how to get the most out of the translator, as opposed to simply trying to run them over. That's really probably, I think, what you're getting at also.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we have just 2 minutes left, I think, or a couple of minutes left. What does anyone want to add something?
Can I say hi?
Oh, hello. How are you?
Hi, I'm Natasha Ulyova. Hello, and actually, I just wanted to make a comment on something which has been said now about Brodsky working with translators. I've just actually published a book on that too. Well, Zakhar knows about it as well. And in fact, I'm looking at Brodsky's work and Brodsky's self-translations in a rather different way from Zakhar's. And in fact, what I'm interested in is precisely what has been talked about just now, his relationship with his translators. And I argue that actually he's not just being dictatorial. He's right. Quite strict about what he wants in the poem and what he doesn't, but he actually is learning from his translators. He's reflecting on their work. And in my book, which is called Joseph Brodsky and Collaborative Self-Translation, it's just been published by Bloomsbury Academic. I compare, I don't look so much at prosody. I'm more interested in what he takes from, what he learns from other translations. And I compare them. I literally look at them one next to another. And I do that at different stages of his career. And you can see how at the beginning of his bilingual career, he borrows quite a lot from his translators. And he sort of constructs his texts almost like out of blocks. And that's a quote from him. And as he goes through his career, he sort of works on the text differently. He reflects, sometimes he comes up with some ideas for his translation, for his self-translation, in a conversation with some of his translators, like in letters. He reflects on what Alan Myers is saying, or he reflects on what some others are saying, you know, George Klein and others. So I think it's not just, I mean, his relationship with his translators, I think, was changing throughout his career. And the way he was creating his self-translations was also changing. And he was sort of shaping his style, I think, in reflection and in reaction often to, you know, the text by other translators. Anyway, but yeah. So that was just, I just wanted to say, it's not just about being authoritarian, it's also about working together on the text.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it's very, very good to defend translators and their work as well. But as you know, in my dissertation, I already reconstructed quite a bit of this history and of those interactions with the translators, and the same goes also for my book. All right, I think that we're running out of time, and in Sweden people are particularly very regimental about it. I think, unless somebody else wants to say something. Irena, oh, you have to unmute you, so I'm trying to unmute you.
I didn't, I just wanted to say goodbye and wanted to thank you very much, and everybody that I heard, and especially the very silenced moderator who was not allowed to talk very much during this session. So maybe we should give him the last word.
Yeah, James?
Yeah, sure. There were a couple of things. I've been kind of taking notes as people are speaking. That, like, when Robert Lowell was doing his version kind of translations, he had his own idea of what translations should look like, and that they should be very literal, so that he could use them, because he was translating from a lot of languages that he didn't know, that he wanted to be able to use those translations sort of as interlinears, so that he thought he could read the poem through the translations so that he could make poems that you couldn't read through the translations. That was very interesting because he wasn't going to do it, but he thought all the translators should do it for him, so that way that's what he would be able to receive. It's very strange because, like, what we have in English of Russian poetry is almost all translations that don't do what Brodsky would have wanted. There's one chapter in your book that talks a lot about his kind of like brutal criticism of Stanley Kunitz's Akhmatova, because it doesn't preserve the rhyme or the meter. And to me, it's funny because Akhmatova would probably be the easiest to translate into English. And I've done it and it's really difficult, but she's the one that writes most like a Western kind of classic lyric poet. And we don't have her that way. The Tsvetaeva we have is nothing like the Russian Tsvetaeva. The Mandelstam, which we have in several versions, like the Peter Green, and the Merwin and other things. And like Mayakovsky sounds to us like a free verse beat poet, only because he looks that way on the page, but obviously he's not in Russian. So like our whole notion of what Russian poetry is so off kilter anyway, but so many people who don't speak Russian and love Russian poetry, and it has this huge reputation. That's what they have. I remember talking once to Eugene Ostashevsky about Mandelstam translations, and like Mandelstam sometimes will like go into decameter, like into 10-beat lines to sort of like match like Homeric verse. And he was like, well, so if you try and turn like his lines into decameter in English, does that make a reference to the Odyssey or the Iliad in Homeric verse? To us, no, because we don't know that it's that way anyway. So what's the point? So sometimes like if you translate the meter and the rhyme, it doesn't have the same import anyway. So sometimes you make decisions about that. When you can do it freely as a translator with poets who are dead and gone and don't have like copyrights anymore being protected by an agent in England. So I've always thought like the simplest verse is very hard to translate. And Brodsky is like the most complicated verse, and that's why he's great. And I guess I would add one more thing, is I was in Rome in 2011, about 10 years ago, for like a memorial set of readings at the Academy of Rome, and about like Joseph's hardship before he was exiled in Lerensky in Arkhangelsk. Because he always kind of like blew it off and acted like he was having a lot of fun, and now everybody thinks that he was maybe being facetious or that wasn't really true. I know Melissa Green has told me about like, because she was friends with him, like it was like hard labor and privation, and it did have effects on his body, and like his eyelashes falling out, kind of like happened to Mandelstam when he was in exile. But somebody asked Adam Zagajewski, the Polish poet, about it. And he said that could all be true and he could be happy. And I was like, well, how do you think he was happy? And he said, well, because he was young and he was beautiful and he was a genius and he knew it. And that's where he got like his bravado from. And I always like to think of him that way. And so that will be my last word.
That's a very nice note to end this conversation upon. So I think of it more of a start of a conversation, and of more to come. And hopefully there's going to be a follow-up to the Poetry and Politics in person symposium for those who took part in it. Okay. I would like to thank everybody, especially James and Barry and Irena. Thank you so much for making me aware that we didn't give James the chance to speak out, and this was so wonderful. And thank you, John. It was wonderful to meet you. And yeah, maybe we'll continue the conversation about translations, and something might come out of it. And thank you everybody else who came and took part.